I'd like to thank the grace of heaven, virtues of masters, grand predecessor, transmitters, and all of you for giving me this opportunity to share this class today. So this diagram shows the cycle of the world, and it looks a little confusing, but it's really just a clock or like a map of time. And there's 12 periods, and each period is 10,800 years. So this whole cycle is 129,600 years. And the longevity saint of the South Pole said he's actually already gone through this entire cycle 7 times. So this represents the beginning of time. Then we had the creation of the realms, earth, man, and then 60,000 or so years pass. And now we are at the white era, which we can think of as the autumn season. And after plants grow in the spring, bloom in the summer, fall is the time to harvest the fruit, or in this case, harvest the soul. So we are harvesting the fruit of achievements from cultivating and accumulating virtues and merits. And throughout time, people started very pure and then became more and more corrupted. And there's always been disasters and calamities, but there's even more now, right? There's been major wars, pandemics, natural disasters, etc. And it just keeps getting worse. So during this time, Tao exists to help save people. And it used to be harder to come across the Tao, and it used to be passed from one patriarch to another. But now in the white era, Tao is readily available for anyone with affinity. And we call this era the universal salvation of the 3 realms, which includes saving humans, temporary heaven saints or divas, and spirits in the underworld. Now, during this white era, 3 sages were sent to carry out this mission and help spread the Tao. And we're really fortunate to have our introducer bring us in to receive the Tao and be disciples of these 3 sages of the white era. So only by respecting their heavenly mandate, continuing their mission, propagating Tao to the rest of the world, and also cultivating ourselves well, then we can hope to repay the kindness of the patriarchs, holy teachers, and transmitting masters. So that's why, as we are disciples of this Tao, we want to get to know the virtues and the legacies and stories of these 3 sages of the white era. And because they're the ones who paved the way for us, so they are a major part of our golden thread. So first we have our 17th Grand Patriarch, Jingeng Zusi. And we also have our 18th Patriarch, Tianran Gufo, and our 18th Matriarch, Zonghua Senmu. So starting with the story of Lu Zongyi, who became the 17th Patriarch, Jingeng Zusi. So this kind of is the story told by our grand predecessor, Lao Qianren. And our Zusi is the incarnation of Maitreya Buddha, or Happy Buddha. And he was born in Shandong province of the eastern coast of China in 1848. And interestingly, that's actually the birthplace of a lot of saints and sages, including Confucius. So Zusi, he had a younger sister, but they lost their parents when they were really young. And there aren't a lot of details from his early life, but according to a book, both his parents were killed by bandits and their house was burned down. And he and his sister actually survived the incident, or maybe were elsewhere during that time. So after they lost their parents, they had to, find a place to stay and learn to survive on their own. Now, after a few years, his sister was able to get married and he went his own way. He joined the army at 22 years old as a cook, but he left the army at 47 years old. But why did he leave the army? Well, Lao Mu, or God, gave Zusi an identical dream over 3 nights, instructing him to seek Tao from the 16th Patriarch Liu. And God told Zusi, you ought to do what you're supposed to be doing. Proceed to Qingzhou in Shandong province and seek 16th Patriarch Liu to receive Tao, and do not crave for matters or things of the mundane world. So after the 3rd night of having the same dream, Zhu Si resigned from his army post and packed all his clothes and his accumulated wages of 100 taels of silver, which was considered a lot, right? So that was 25 years of money he saved up. And that's everything he had, and he set off towards the south. So Zhu Si was stationed with the army in Tianjin when he was instructed to go to Qingzhou, which is about like 250 or 300 miles away. And obviously transportation was very limited back then, so he likely had to walk, which would have taken him over a week. Now imagine if we had, a dream like this. Would we be willing to quit our jobs and walk for a week just to seek the Tao? I think most of us would probably ignore the dream, right? So it's really special that he had such sincere faith and was willing to do that. And each night he would receive instructions in a dream telling him where to go next. And then one particular night, the instruction was tomorrow to go to this mountain to seek the enlightening master to receive Tao. And on that same night, 16th Patriarch Liu also had a dream, giving him instructions as well, saying that tomorrow morning a great worthy or a sage will come ashore, go down the mountain, and welcome him. So the next morning, 16th Patriarch Liu went down to the mountain bright and early to wait for this great worthy. Well, he saw Zhu Si, and he was frankly not impressed with how he looked, his appearance. Zhu Si was, short and stocky. He wore a furry hat and a torn jacket, carrying a knapsack. So he didn't look, extraordinary or particularly special in any way. And 16th Patriarch Liu thought, could this really be the great worthy from my dream? So Zhu Si came up to him and asked, is this the place where I can seek the Tao? And 16th Patriarch Liu replied, oh, you're seeking the Tao? Well, it's going to cost 100 taels of silver to receive the Tao. And then Zhu Si replied, well, if it's 100 taels of silver, then 100 taels of silver it is. I want to receive the Tao. So seeing Zhu Si, express the sincere intention to receive Tao, 16th Patriarch Liu said, okay, I can transmit the Tao to you then. So the patriarch led Zhu Si up the mountain into the monastery, and Zhu Si opened his knapsack and really did take out the 100 taels of silver he had and handed all of it to 16th Patriarch Liu. So 16th Patriarch Liu was actually like half joking when he said the requirement was 100 taels of silver, since that's so much. He didn't actually expect Zhu Si to have that amount of money, and so he felt kind of bad about it, but proceeded to accept the money and transmit Tao to him. So this shows that Zhu Si was worthy of receiving the Tao because it took him 25 years to save that amount of money. Now, if we imagine that we were required to pay 25 years of our salaries as our merit fee, I could bet that most of us would not receive the Tao, right? So it just goes to show that he really did have the utmost innocence and sincerity, much like a pure and innocent kid, child. And back then, the patriarchs actually did test people who were seeking the Tao. Today, we're not tested that way, but we do still have to pay a merit fee per general guan, and nobody can substitute and pay for someone else's merit fee because the person who's paying it and receiving the Tao needs to show their own sincerity. So if a person, has sufficient foundation and affinity, then the person wouldn't even think twice about the merit fee, whereas others who don't might not be willing to pay that merit fee at all. So that's one of the first hurdles we have to overcome, this test of sincerity. Now, after transmitting Tao, 16th Patriarch Liu said, okay, well, you can go home now. And Zhu Si said, well, I served in the army for so many years. I've given my entire life savings to you, my teacher, and I have no home to go back to. So I would like to stay here and cultivate Tao with you. And when he heard this, 16th Patriarch Liu had already taken and accepted his life savings. So he had to let him stay, right? So he asked Zhu Si, well, what can you do? And Zhu Si said he was illiterate, he couldn't read, but he could do unskilled work. So 16th Patriarch Liu told him, then in that case, you can gather firewood, fetch water, and cook in the kitchen. So Zhu Si, he accepted the responsibility to work in the kitchen. And, others who were more educated could be in the temple to study the Dharma and take part in Zen meditation. But Zhu Si, he every single day gathered and chopped firewood, cooked every day for years and years. And also, he's not the only patriarch who started cultivating this way, right? So we should never look down on those who just cook or are illiterate, etc. They could be Buddhas too. So we really don't know. We're all equal, right? So ZhiShan spent years cultivating in the kitchen, and when 16th Patriarch Liu was around 50 or 60 years old, he was beginning to think about passing the mandate to a successor. And 16th Patriarch Liu asked, Lao Mu God, who should be his successor? And Lao Mu answered, the great worthy or sage is right in front of you. So not knowing who God was talking about, 16th Patriarch Liu asked again, who is this person? And Lao Mu, or God, said, are you asking where Maitreya is? Look carefully in the sea of people. The one who wears a wool hat, dressed in ordinary clothes, speaks truthfully and constantly bequeaths humanity and righteousness. So watch, and the word Lu is split two ways. The point is in the middle. So the word He can be witnessed clearly by the sun and moon. The words Ren and Gong are held in his hands. So meaning someone's hands have the word that indicates who God is talking about, and is suggesting that this person is the incarnation of Maitreya Buddha. So this was really actually hinting at ZhiShan's Chinese name, Lu Zongyi, right? But 16th Patriarch Liu still couldn't figure out who Lao Mu was talking about. And something to know is, when we ask heaven for answers, most of the time the answers will not be explicit and direct, especially if there's heaven's secret that can't be revealed at the time. But if we have that wisdom, then we might be able to understand. So 16th Patriarch Liu asked again, who is this person? Well, Lao Mu told him that the time is not yet come to reveal who it is. So sometime later, it suddenly dawned on the 16th Patriarch that the person's hands would actually have the markings of these two characters. So he called everyone to wash their hands and line up at the assembly hall, and he asked each of them to show the palms of their hands for him to look at. But he did not see those two character markings on any of those people's hands. Then ZhiShan washed his hands and rushed in from the kitchen, raising his hands and asked, well, what about my hands? And 16th Patriarch Liu didn't really even bother to look closely at his and said, how is it possible for him to have these marks? So it wouldn't be for another 7 years in 1905 before ZhiShan actually received the heaven's mandate in the heavenly post. So that's when people realized that Lao Mu had already revealed his name indirectly. So what we need to know about that is that, external appearance of Buddhas may not be impressive. They could be uneducated, but their virtue is so great. So we should never judge a book by its cover. Now, after some time, 16th Patriarch Liu said to everyone, I'm getting old, the Tao flow has declined, and under the circumstances, I can't sustain it. So each of you have heaven's mandate to propagate the Tao, go down the mountain and fulfill our destinies. So they all packed their bags, some went home, some pioneered Tao in new places, but only ZhiShan felt sad in his heart because everyone else had a family, and he had been away from his hometown for so many years. His parents had already passed really early on. He had no news from his hometown or his sister, so his future was very uncertain. So he asked 16th Patriarch Liu if, he could ask Lao Mu for instructions since he has no home to return to. And 16th Patriarch Liu said yes. So the altar was prepared, and they asked Lao Mu, and Lao Mu said, these are the end times, the white era of universal salvation. The great Tao's openly spread throughout the world. Establish a temple in Sendong and propagate the pure and upright Tao. And Lao Mu also said to stay in the Guanyin nunnery, which ZhiShan thought was kind of odd. But this was actually a foreshadowing of the future by Lao Mu. Now, after returning to his hometown in Sendong, he researched and finally found his sister. And when they met, his sister actually could not believe that he was her brother because she thought he had died since he was in the army and she hadn't heard from him in 30 years. But ZhiShan talked about the days when they were little and surviving on scraps of food, and how she got married and he joined the army. So his sister finally accepted that that indeed was her brother. And at this point in her life, she already had 2 sons. So her family situation was really quite poor. But despite those poor conditions, she still accepted her brother and took him in. So this really shows how open-hearted she was. So Zusi spoke about the Dharma and transmitted Tao to his sister's family. And they established a home temple and started to propagate the Tao, gradually expanding. And later on, even the two sons eventually became transmitting masters and propagated the Tao as well. And during this time, without the guidance of any patriarch, many of 16th Patriarch's disciples went back to their previous lives while others were propagating Tao. But within like 5 to 7 years, Zusi was actually the most successful. So he ended up with the mandate and became the 17th Patriarch. So even though our Zusi, the 17th Patriarch, was illiterate, he could speak the Dharma because it came from his true Tao heart, from his Buddha nature. So propagating Tao doesn't require, a lot of extensive knowledge, as long as we're talking about our understanding and our experience from a sincere Tao heart, right? From that Buddha nature. So in 1925, 17th Patriarch suddenly had dysphagia, or difficulty swallowing, and his disciples weren't sure what to believe about the Tao anymore, because they thought, how could a patriarch with heaven's mandate have such a condition? So, 17th Patriarch decided to test his disciples, and he told everyone, I've cultivated Tao and observed the precepts for decades. Now I'm terminally ill, which shows that Tao is not true. From now on, everyone will decide their own future, and there's no need to continue cultivating this Tao. So he told the cooks to go buy meat and make these meat buns. Then he told everyone to eat them. So of course, 17th Patriarch couldn't eat them because he couldn't swallow, right? So a lot of the disciples were really conflicted. They'd all taken the vegetarian vow, yet a lot of them still ate the meat buns because they felt they needed to obey their teacher. But instead, they broke their vows. Only the youngest disciple, Sizun, did not eat the meat buns, claiming he had a stomach ache. So this showed Sizun, even though he was the youngest, had the most wisdom. Okay, so since ancient times, cultivators were tested by their teachers. But since 1938, tests were administered by heaven through people and through matters. So we have to make sure we develop our wisdom, through cultivation so that we can also pass tests. So by the time 17th Patriarch Zusi returned to heaven, he had a few thousand disciples with about 8 senior leaders among them, including future 18th Patriarch Sizun. So 17th Patriarch Zusi lived to the age of 76 and had white hair and a childlike appearance with reddish cheeks. So we saw how he was, very childlike purity and innocent throughout his life. And after he returned to heaven, a successor had not been chosen yet. So the leaders had asked 17th Patriarch Zusi for instructions. Who should get the mandate? So 17th Patriarch told them to wait 100 days and he will give them a message. But before the 100th day, the elder leaders were very impatient. So they decided to ask Lamu instead, who should get the mandate? And what we need to know is that when we are asking for answers through oracles or divination, if we ask something too many times, the answer's not always going to be accurate, and it could even be contradictory and confusing. So Lamu decided to tell them they all had the mandate. They thought, if Lamu said it, then it's for sure. But in this case, it was a test. So 17th Patriarch had already told them to wait 100 days, but since they disobeyed, they brought this test on themselves. And they also forgot that since ancient times, the mandate was passed to only 1 or 2 people at a time, not a whole bunch of people. So anyway, they all set off on their separate ways to propagate the Tao, all except for Sizun, who continued to wait the 100 days. And on the 100th day, Lamu gave instructions and said that 17th Patriarch's sister will hold the mandate temporarily for 12 years. So this was kind of unexpected since a woman has never held a patriarch mandate. So a lot of them did not believe this was true or even possible. But during this time, Sizun always did the most and always reported to the 17th Patriarch sister, whereas the rest of the leaders, took matters into their own hands without respecting Lamu's instructions. So some of them ended up passing away and some could not grow their Tao affairs. But the 17th Patriarch sister returned to heaven around the 6th year. So remember when we talked about how Lamu told the 17th patriarch to go to the Guanyin nunnery? Well, that was a foreshadowing of this because 17th patriarch's sister was actually the incarnation of Guanyin Bodhisattva. So they have a lot of affinity together. Now, after the 17th patriarch had passed, he channeled for 100 days to share Dharma and teachings, and that's when the famous Maitreya Disaster Rescue Sutra was created. So now let's jump and talk about the story of our 18th patriarch Sizun, or Tianran Gufo. He's also known by the name of Zangguangbi, and he is the incarnation of Qigong Living Buddha, our holy teacher. Now, he was born in 1889 in Jining, and when he was born, the normally, muddy yellow river became very clear, and the temple of heaven in Beijing actually caught on fire. So it gave the sky this, a radiant red glow, and there was a fragrant scent from the burning wood, indicating a sage is born. And his appearance was known to be peculiar. He had double pupils and a flat head with a square shape. He's also known to be very talented, intelligent, and loyal, and came from a scholarly family. At 20, he helped with his family's small shop, and in 1911, at the age of 22, he followed his uncle to Shanghai and worked as a military official in the army. But less than a year later, Sizun's father wrote to request him to come home immediately, and since he was the only son, he was filial and followed his father's instructions. So he resigned from his army post and returned home. And his father knew the date he was going to leave this world, even though he wasn't even very old, maybe in his 40s. But he asked Sizun, his son, to make funeral arrangements for him. And Sizun kind of was wondering why his father would ask him to do that when his dad wasn't very old, didn't have any serious illnesses. So he just kind of ignored it and didn't do what he was asked. Now, after a few days, his father requested again to prepare for a funeral, saying, if you don't listen, you're wasting time. And I've made urgent requests to make preparations. But Sizun just couldn't understand, so he still did not prepare. Then one day his father told him, I'm leaving now. I've already washed my face, put on the proper attire. Everything's ready, so I'm going to go now. And do not cry. And he closed his eyes and really did leave this world. And because of the sudden passing of his father, everyone really couldn't accept it. Right? So they all started crying. But because of their crying, his father's spirit came back and suddenly his eyes opened and said, I told you not to cry, but because you're crying, it was difficult for me to leave and it pulled me back. Now I'm telling you that you did not prepare or burn the paper sedan carrying chair to help send me off to the spirit world. And because I heard your crying, I couldn't leave in peace and I came back. So then Sizun finally prepared and burned the paper carrying chair and completed the funeral service. And afterwards, Sizun had stayed with his mother to take care of home and family matters. In 1915, Sizun was 26 when he met transmitter Tu, who was spreading the Tao, and the transmitter tried to ferry Sizun, but Sizun did not believe it and sent his mom to receive the Tao instead to see what it was about. And after his mom had received the Tao and spent some time studying the Tao, his mother felt that the Tao was very good. So she also heard it was possible to uplift, parents who've passed to transcend this cycle of suffering, this cycle of reincarnation. And since Sizun felt he had not been filial enough, he decided to receive Tao to repay his father's grace. Now afterwards, Sizun followed transmitter Tu to propagate and pioneer the Tao and establish temples. So Sizun became very sincere and diligent in Tao cultivation, and within 2 years, he had ferried his family members, relatives, and acquaintances, ferrying a total of 64 people. But in order to uplift a parent back then, they required merits from ferrying 100 people. Now, after Sizun had ferried 64 people, he couldn't find anyone else to bring to the temple. So he was sad and worried that he couldn't uplift his father. But seeing how sincere and diligent Sizun was, transmitter 2 was, really touched and asked 17th Patriarch what they could do. And since Sizun couldn't find anyone else to ferry, he needed to ask for instructions. So 17th Patriarch went and asked Lamu, and Lamu was also touched by Sizun's sincere filial heart. So Lamu said starting with Sizun, merits from ferrying 64 people would be enough to uplift a parent. Now at that time, Sizun had not yet met the 17th Patriarch. It wasn't until 1920, after Sizun's teacher, transmitter 2, returned to heaven, that 17th Patriarch heard about it, and he knew how dedicated and talented Sizun was, that the 17th Patriarch asked someone to go find him. Once Sizun was found and brought to meet 17th Patriarch, Sizun paid his respect, and 17th Patriarch asked, your teacher, transmitter 2, is no longer here, so who do you want to cultivate and propagate Tao with? And Sizun, said, please tell me. I'll follow Patriarch's instructions. Whoever you tell me to follow, I'll follow. So 17th Patriarch said, okay, fine, then you can follow me. So afterwards, Sizun followed 17th Patriarch to cultivate and propagate Tao for 6 years. And eventually, 17th Patriarch returned to heaven, as we know. And remember, we said Sizun was his youngest disciple. Now, only Sizun waited that 100 days after he passed to receive instructions from the 17th Patriarch. And we said that on that 100th day, Lamu said that 17th Patriarch's sister would hold the mandate temporarily. So we know that the other leaders didn't really believe this, and they continued to propagate and manage Tao affairs on their own. And they actually would not hand over the merit fees to the 17th Patriarch's sister. So merit fees need to be handed to the Patriarch, or in this case, 17th Patriarch's sister. But since they didn't recognize her as having the mandate, they kept it all for themselves. So only Sizun followed the instructions of the 17th Patriarch and Lamu in carrying out the Tao affairs. Okay, so now let's jump and talk about the third sage, our 18th matriarch, Simu, or Zhonghua Senmu. So she was born Sun Suzhen, but her Tao name was Sun Huiming, and she was the incarnation of the moon and wisdom Yehui Bodhisattva. So Simu was born in 1895, and she was known to be very quiet and virtuous and kind. Now, 17th Patriarch had ferried Simu to receive the Tao, and at the time, she was already considered by many people as a living female bodhisattva, and already had 1,000 followers. So when 17th Patriarch came to ferry her, she actually realized that the Patriarch was true. So she and her followers all received the Tao. Now, before the 17th Patriarch left, he gave Simu the transmitting master mandate so that she could also spread the Tao. So we should know that Simu actually had bound feet, or they called it lotus feet back then, making it really challenging and painful to walk. Now, during that time, Sizun and Simu, they were propagating Tao throughout China, so they had to walk most places. So we can't even imagine how difficult and painful that must have been, right? So she received the mandate of the Tao Post in 1930 for the last salvation mission of the three realms with Sizun. So Lamu gave the mandate and heavy responsibility jointly to Sizun and Simu for the universal salvation of the three realms mission, as we said, this final great harvest. And only with male and female, patriarch and matriarch, both jointly having the mandate, could the mission be carried out. So men and women were now equals. Women could finally also receive the Tao, cultivate, and propagate. So what we need to know is that without Simu, us women could never have received Tao and cultivated. So we owe her so much. And this time also symbolized the start of cultivating in daily life, and regardless of education or occupation. So now, it's part cultivating and part living our regular mundane life. There's no need to give up our careers or families to cultivate anymore. So anyone, as long as they have the affinity, can receive Tao and ultimately achieve. But at the time, men and women could not really be seen together unless they were married. So Sizun and Simu had to be married just in name so that they could go out and propagate together. So this was a match that was decided by heaven. And the Buddhas and saints announced this union everywhere, but nobody could believe it. So Sizun and Simu, they were actually both resented over the situation, and it made them feel very ashamed. And of course, Sizun's wife, he was already married and had children, was obviously, opposed to this arrangement. Now, the Grand Patriarch makes the decision, and Lamu has the ultimate authority to assign the Tao post. So one time, Grand Patriarch told Sizun and Simu to return to Sizun's home. Now, obviously, Sizun's wife was very angry, but she actually stood there with her hands behind her back, and she found that she suddenly couldn't move her arms or hands. And this lasted 1 month. Okay, so for that month, Sizun just kept encouraging and persuading her that this union was heaven's will. Now, finally, after that 1 month, Sizun's wife relented, and she could finally use her arms and hands again. So after this, Sizun and Simu, they pioneered and planted seeds of Tao all over. They endured so many hardships, but Simu was no longer afraid to undertake this joint mission, but, she preferred to work separately. So Grand Patriarch would actually come to instruct each of them separately on where they should go, and they would be surprised when they would end up in the same place. Okay, so the immortals would channel and teach the Dharma, and many people came to receive the Tao. And during that time, some of the former leaders who were no longer alive, some could not develop their Tao field, couldn't propagate any further. Now, all of those people, they were subject to slander, and only the followers of Sizun and Simu were fine. So this all shows that it was by divine will and arrangement. And afterwards, there were some who came back to acknowledge Sizun and Simu as the holy teachers with heaven's mandate. Then their Tao affairs gradually expanded. In 1931, Simu uplifted Zhaohua Bodhisattva during a repentance class. So the reason for this class was for disciples who came back after leaving when Simu received the heaven's mandate. So during this class, Lady Bodhisattva brought a celestial diva who was an herbalist when she was alive. And after being uplifted, Zhaohua Bodhisattva went to many places and helped propagate the Tao. And she actually introduced 3,000 people to receive the Tao. So as a result of her merits and virtues, she received the title of Zhaohua Bodhisattva. And afterwards, many other celestial divas or temporary heaven saints were also uplifted. So Simu had declared that the predecessor of every major Tao group could uplift a temporary heaven saint. So in the case of our Lao Qianren, or our grand predecessor, he chose to uplift Sima Guang, who was a very famous scholar and historian from 1,000 years ago. And this person had a lot of wisdom and even saved a friend when he was little. Now, what's interesting is that any diva who's uplifted will actually help the Tao affairs of the group where they receive the Tao. Now, because Sima Guang was a scholar, he was not wealthy, but he was very well educated. So many of the people that are in the PeiDe group, they tend to be students or scholars, which is especially true in the PeiDe Congde branch, and they even opened their own university. So another example is the Baoguang group. Their predecessor uplifted Bigan, which turned out to be a diva of wealth. And the Baoguang group tends to have many wealthy merchants or businessmen. And we can see it in their temples, which are very big, expensive, and lavish. Okay, so over this period of time, Sizun and Simu held many Dharma classes. They helped set up temples, they transmitted the Tao, and they did a lot to progress the Tao mission. But unexpectedly in 1936, the government ordered an investigation into the religious group called One Heart Tian Dao Longhua Holy Assembly. And the teachings were similar to the teachings of the Tao, but the leader of this religious sect was called Ma Siwei, who considered himself to be a king. So his followers had to take on his name Ma. So the government investigator came to Sizun's temple asking if there was anyone there with the surname Ma. So Sizun said yes, but without asking who was who, the investigator actually took Sizun and 4 others into custody. But none of them were actually involved in this Ma religious group. So they actually got the wrong people. But the matter wasn't cleared up until 1937. So they were held for about 300 days. And afterwards, an immortal had revealed that Lamu in an earlier scripture said that 5 elders in Nanjing furnace. So even patriarchs have to be tempered and refined. Now, if it were us, I don't know if we would be able to pass that kind of test, right? Being locked up for almost a year, and not even for something we did, that we were imprisoned by mistake. So that's, those hardships are crazy. And, we have to appreciate how much that they had to go through, right? So during this time, Simu was in Jinan and encouraging and telling disciples not to act rashly. So Tao affairs began to flourish slowly after. And it wasn't until 1938 when Lao Qinren, our grand predecessor, received the Tao, and then there were temples in Beijing. So in 1939, Sizun established the provisional temple rules and regulations to help cultivators avoid or lessen any catastrophes in disasters or tests. And Sizun and Simu, they never desired positions in heaven, but they sacrificed everything for the mission to save sentient beings. Now, during World War II, it became a war zone everywhere. There were bombs everywhere. But Sizun and Simu were so worried for everyone that Sizun still traveled all over the country to spread the Tao nonstop. So can we even imagine living in this time and still trying to spread the Tao, right? We aren't even really willing now when things are considerably more peaceful compared to back then. But during these 8 years of conflict during the war, Sizun and Simu and some of their followers suffered from a lot of hardships and ordeals, but they were able to escape the calamity safely. So there's a saying that good people are blessed. And, many who received the Tao, sincerely cultivated and upheld the true principles, were able to lessen bad situations. So that's still true today. If we are sincere in our cultivation, then we can help mitigate bad situations whenever we encounter them, so that it won't be as bad. And after the war was finally over, the predecessors took turns inviting Sizun and Simu to various places to grace the Tao communities. But in 1947, our 18th patriarch Sizun saw this strange or abnormal fruit fall to the ground in front of him, and he was a bit suspicious of it and knew it was not a good sign. And since then, Sizun's health kept deteriorating. Therefore, Sizun called a gathering on Mid-Autumn Day. They held a banquet and invited local Tao members and officials for lunch. And after the lunch, Sizun had said to everyone, "Today's gathering is of great significance." So Sizun was kind of sending off the guests. He said, "We will meet again someday." And the guests were kind of confused and not sure what that meant. Well, around 3 p.m., Sizun wasn't feeling very well, so the Tao members helped him to his room to rest. And after sunset, Simu was praying to God. Then God and a group of Buddhas and immortals came to the altar, bringing the top 10 doctors throughout China's history. And they all gave, reassuring words saying that Sizun's bad health was irrelevant because of everyone's sincerity. So Sizun even wanted to get out of bed to pay respect to Lamu, God, but the Tao members stopped him since he was so weak. And around 8 p.m. when the channeling had ended, they had discovered that Sizun was no longer with them. So he had passed. And Lamu had brought Sizun back to absolute heaven, and he was only 59 years old. So teacher and disciples, they were separated this day, and it was sad news, right? So it was said that the 3 realms were in shock, mountains and rivers were in tears, even the trees and grass were sad. A great sage of our generation, an enlightened master, a model teacher who served to very sentient beings. So his passing is a great loss for all sentient beings. And on the 5th day, Simu asked Sizun through channeling to give instructions. And Simu asked about a lot of different things, but the last thing Sizun said during the channeling was about his future burial site. So the tomb is to be built at Westlake near Yuchao Pond, facing Nanping Mountain to the north, and Phoenix Mountain to the east, Westlake on the left, and Jade Emperor Mountain on the right. And Sizun's family was notified of his passing, so they all traveled, as well as all the predecessors, to make funeral arrangements. And Sizun's body was flown to his instructed area, and the monks at the temples there kept saying, Jigong Buddha has returned. And so they cleaned the temples and they painted it, and the monks chanted sutras nonstop. And they had this inauguration ceremony of Jigong Pagoda Hupao Temple. So an endless stream of worshippers came to pay their respects, saying that Jigong Living Buddha came to this world and returned to Hengzong, Westlake, after he passed away. So we know he is the incarnation of our Jigong Living Buddha. So after Sizun had returned to heaven, Simu was left to carry on the responsibilities and mission by herself. And in 1948, our grand predecessor was considering pioneering Tao in Xi'an, but Simu actually gave him instructions to go southeast instead, meaning Taiwan. So she said that they would have some difficulty pioneering Tao in Taiwan for the first 10 years or so, but if she had the true heavens mandate, then after 10 years, the Tao affairs would expand and flourish, proving that her mandate is true, right? There are still people who believed Simu did not have the true heavens mandate. So this showed Simu had the foresight to know the coming changes in China's government, and she had been telling the predecessors to leave China and pioneer Tao elsewhere. So just a year later, the communists took over China as she predicted, so Simu took refuge in Hong Kong. In 1950, she worried about her disciples and decided to return back to mainland China to live and die with them because, she was so worried for them. But because of the continuous persecution by the communists, the Tao elders kept pleading with our matriarch to leave the mainland. And it wasn't until 1954 or 1955 that grand predecessor arranged for Simu to move to Taiwan. And something to know is Simu was actually very frugal and thoughtful. So one time they were outside on a really hot day and she saw a street vendor selling watermelon. But Simu would not let her disciples buy the watermelon for her, even though it only cost 10 cents. She said that the money belongs to sentient beings. So we can see really how virtuous she is. She would even sew the 3 talents clothes by hand herself. So in 1961, Tao communities were suffering from the peak of hardships. The Taiwan government was cracking down on Tao activities. So a lot of classes and gatherings had to be stopped for a while. Temples were shut down. There was a lot of slander about the Tao. And many predecessors and seniors were arrested, jailed, and even tortured. And eventually, they were able to hold some classes, like the repentance class, and thousands of Tao members would attend. Our matriarch would shoulder 70% of the karmic debts of these class members, always working in the background. So Simu said that in order to dissolve sentient beings' calamities and suffering, let me help bear their karmic debts. Heaven said back to her that this is actually sentient beings' group karma, which needs to be repaid by them. But Simu prayed and said, I'm also a sentient being, so let me repay for them. So we can see how benevolent and loving Simu is to all of her disciples, including us, right? Simu was very humble and motherly, and she cared for her disciples as if they were her own children. So Simu imposed self-imprisonment for the rest of her life and said that since they want to lock up my disciples, confine me instead. Since they want to torture my disciples, torture me instead. And she would do 10,000 bows every day to plead with heaven to end the hardships in the Tao field and to take on the karmic debts of sentient beings herself. But taking on sentient beings and disciples' karmic debts to herself in order to help Tao development, it caused her health to decline. In her later years, she had a stroke which hindered her mobility, and there's the sutra that says, a bodhisattva who's ill is because of great compassion. And our 18th matriarch is exactly that. She's a bodhisattva who was ill because of her great compassion for everyone, and because sentient beings all have illnesses. So she devoted her entire life to the last salvation of mankind. And so we owe her and all of our predecessors and patriarchs so much. Because of her, females were able to receive the Tao and cultivate. Because of all of these patriarchs and sages, we are able to find the Tao. So if they had given up on their mission, then none of us would ever have the Tao to receive or to cultivate. So Simu completed her holy mission and returned to absolute heaven in 1975 at age 81. And God gave her the holy title, Divine Matriarch Zonghua, or Zonghua Simu. So when she passed, the skies were dark and thunderstorming, heavy rain, heavy wind, and it's because our physical realm had lost this big bodhisattva. After she passed, she came back through a channeling with a scripture and said, wishing matriarchs' vows, let disciples carry out Tao affairs in peace. Wishing matriarchs' vows, let disciples return to heavenly positions. And wishing matriarchs' tears, let disciples truly cultivate and propagate Tao. Wishing matriarchs' confinement lets disciples overcome difficulties. And matriarch made a vow that she will bear disciples' hardships and endure their sufferings, just hoping that every sincerely cultivating disciple is safe and propagates Tao well. So we're really fortunate to be one of their disciples. They are always shouldering a lot of our karmic debts for us while we cultivate and accumulate some merits. So we have to do everything we can to better ourselves, to help others while we have this opportunity they've given us. And we can think of them as our saviors in this white era, this final salvation time. So we can think of Grand Patriarch as our grandfather, and Sizun and Simu as our Tao father and mother. So Sizun is more in the foreground and represents the sun, while Simu represents the moon and works in the background. So they are our holy teachers. And without them, there would be no Tao to pass on to our generation or future generations. Because of their hardships and unwavering perseverance and diligence to their mission of this universal salvation, that's why we're able to cultivate in this time. So our tests and hardships are considerably easier compared to theirs. That's why it's important that we know who they are. We know their stories and their legacies. Okay? So they're the ones who paved the way for us. So we don't want to let them down, just like we wouldn't want to let down our own parents, our own grandparents, right? We can learn so much from them, their legacies, and their virtues. So Holy Teacher Tianran Sizun's 3 noble vows: from absolute heaven, ferry and transform sentient beings to return home; from the mundane world, transform people and societies by innate virtues and bring about world unity; and to continue this ancient sage's holy mission and develop the same path forward, restore the culture of Tao lineage since ancient times. And in a scripture by Grand Patriarch Jingong Zusi, he said that the gold and jade temple of glorious splendor requires everyone's support and effort to guide. So that's true, right? Our Tao affairs can only flourish when all of us work together. He said the will of Jigong's disciples is set on the ideal of a utopian world. Continue the generational patriarchs and matriarchs' legacy. One must honor the source and undertake the mission. So he is saying that it's our turn now, this generation, to carry on this mission and do the best we can to spread the Tao. Resolve to seek the holy teacher, even if one is well learned, manifest wisdom and courage, and progress with great humanity. So bring out our Buddha nature, right? Help make the world a better place. So to conclude, cultivation we can think of as like climbing a tall pole. It's easy to slide down, but it's hard to go up. So true Tao is achieved by going up against the adverse force, and one shall become a saint. So No matter what hardships we encounter, never step backwards, never retreat. Always keep taking even small steps forward, right? Always keep going. In this final period, we are tested for our wisdom. Heresies and the devil will tamper with our true mind and our Tao mind to see whether we possess wisdom to separate truth from falsehood. So again, we want to develop our wisdom through cultivating our sincere Buddha nature, our heart. That's the way we can pass these tests and have our wisdom. And Holy Teacher said, one cannot fail or one cannot fall if they hold a proper notion. So there needs to be true tests and cultivation. Do not waver, hold steadfast to the divine golden thread, recognize the truth, break falsehood, and cultivate according to the true principle. We're all going to keep encountering tests on our path of cultivation, but hopefully nothing as hard and challenging as what our patriarchs and predecessors went through. So we should consider ourselves fortunate and just do our very best to carry on their legacies and their missions. Okay, so that concludes the class today. If I said anything wrong, I ask for Heaven's forgiveness and for transmitters and lecturers to please correct me. Thank you.